should you get the vaccine or not? That is a question that all of you have been asking yourselves, and people have been asking me. And I posted a video that, I was sharing what I know. And then I realized, you know what? I don't know enough to be actually chiming in on this. And I should actually find the smartest person I know and invite them to come and have a conversation. And that's exactly what we're doing. I've invited Elroy Vojdani, who is absolutely the smartest, most competent, integrative immunologist physician that I know. And to say he's the doctor's doctor is an understatement. One, he takes care of my parents. That's how much I trust him and how much I value his medical expertise. And I trust their care in his hands 100%. Every immunological train wreck that I have that I am clueless about, I send them to him, and instantly he's like, this is what's going on. And he has helped so many people, and other people look at him in the same way. Now, Elroy isn't just a physician, he's also a researcher. He's published over 20 papers in the field of integrative immunology. And if you're curious, just type in Vojdani in PubMed and you will see articles by him and his father. And his father, by most standards, who actually helped inform his education. So Dr. Vojdani actually says, he grew up in the Vojdani University because as a kid, he was actually at his dad's side in the laboratory studying and just learning from him. His dad has published over 60 papers in the field of integrative immunology. He is the grandfather of integrative immunology by most standards. And together, they've actually published a book on food sensitivities and how the gut and all of these things impact us. So literally, I cannot think of a smarter, more capable person than Dr. Elroy Vojdani to be joining me to have this conversation. I'm honored because he's a super busy guy. And the fact that he took the time to join us and have this discussion is like awesome. And it turns out that 2 days ago, Drs. Vojdani, he and his father, along with another physician, actually published a paper on COVID and how it impacts the immune system and all of the complex immunological interactions that take place behind the scenes that cause all kinds of the weird things that we're seeing. So not only is he a smart guy, he literally just published a paper on this topic, which is what we're going to talk about. And it turns out that he and his family had COVID. So literally the most perfect person. And all of you need to tune in. All of you need to share this video with other people because this is critical information that everyone needs to have. So without further ado, I am honored and privileged to be introducing Dr. Elroy Vojdani to you.
Thank you for the incredibly warm welcome. It's my absolute honor to be here and, to get an opportunity to put our minds together for such an important topic is I think, a very special thing. So thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Thank you for being here. Anything you want to share with the audience before we get into, I think the article, and I encourage everyone to actually pull up this article and read it for themselves. It's available to the public. We're going to put the notes in the caption or in the notes so you can just literally reference that and pull it up. But where would you like to go before we get into this article, which is really fascinating?
Yeah, so first, please go out there, get a copy of the journal article. It's in Frontiers in Immunology. That's the largest open access immunology journal in the country and around the world. I think that this paper was absolutely, the outcome of a lot of love and passion for the field of immunology and autoimmunity, and understanding that we're still in the middle of a tremendous public health crisis, and the more information that we have, the better armed we are to make decisions to go forward and to make sure that we're keeping our health in mind.
Awesome. And just to give you all a framework, our goal is not to tell you what to do. And neither Dr. Vojdani or I are going to tell you should get the vaccine, you shouldn't get the vaccine. And we're not even going to get into those technicalities. The purpose of today's discussion is to really help you understand what COVID does to the immune system and how much complexity. And I mean, for all of you guys saw early on, I was just like, you know what, this virus is nasty, but don't freak out over it. And I was the one that was talking about, we've overestimated the death rates and so forth. But I think as you compare, what are the risks of the vaccine versus what are the risks of COVID? Because the reality is at some point, unless you guys are really going to stay low, and I mean, we have some families that are moving to New Zealand, for instance, because they're like, you know what, we can't get the vaccine and I don't want to get the virus. And I'm like, I understand your immune system is so compromised. I wouldn't want you to get either. So outside of that, we're ultimately going to get exposed to one of these two. And now
Mhm.
I want all of you to figure out, what is the true risk of getting COVID and become really informed on that. And hopefully what we can do is also give you, based on Dr. Vojdani's understanding of all of this, what are the potential, and that's really all we can say, the potential risks of the virus, the vaccine.
Yeah.
And from there, you guys make the choice. This is not a pro-vaccine, not an anti-vaccine, and we don't want to make it that at all. We just want to give you information, and this is literally hot off the press. So this is probably the latest, best information you can possibly be getting.
Mhm. Well said. I guess I'll take it from there and we can start diving into where this project came from, how long we've been working on it, what the spirit of this is.
Please.
Back in March, as we were, March of 2020, as we were first hit with COVID in the United States in a major way, physicians like myself and yourself were doing our best to guide people through what was very much unknown. What was this infection going to look like in the short term? Who was going to get it? We saw different experiences in South Korea, Italy. We didn't know how much of it was here in the United States. So we came from this place of extremely little understanding. It became pretty quickly evident that a very significant number of people who survived the infection would experience some very unusual, unexpected long-term consequences. And those of us in the global immunology community really started putting our heads together to say, why? What is going on with these people who are chronically fatigued, who have chronic lung issues, who are finding themselves with cardiomyopathy or heart problems for months and months and months? How is this happening? We need to figure this out because we have to learn how to help these people. And, I remember turning to my dad, I think it was maybe the second or third week of April when we saw some of these cases kind of come to light. And I said, you know what, it has to be cross-reactivity. There's obviously going to be tremendous immune injury with COVID. And it makes sense that something called cross-reactivity has to be playing a role in why these people, at least in some part, are injured or damaged for months or years to come.
Before you go on, do you mind helping people understand what cross-reactivity is? Because I think, outside of our immune world, most people don't know what that term means. So what is cross-reactivity and why is that important?
My pleasure. It's an incredibly important concept to understand. Cross-reactivity is the way in which an immune system can inadvertently make a mistake where it has an intention to attack one thing that should be attacked, but accidentally attacks our own tissue, which it should not attack. And the reason that happens is that because antibodies, which are our very important secondary and final line of defense, as far as new things that come our way are concerned, are relatively small. They can only recognize small fragments of things. Proteins are very large, especially in the scale of what an antibody is. So you have this small weapon and a very large target. So the immune system says, okay, let me just kind of pick and choose which fragment of this target I want to identify, and let me just target it. Now, it can't do so with 100% selectiveness. When it creates an antibody, it'll stick to what it intended to stick to. But if there's something that's 70 or 60 or 50% similar to the target in your own body, then it will also stick to that and attack that indirectly. So cross-reactivity is an accidental misfiring by our own defense system.
It's almost like a misunderstanding
Absolutely.
of the immune system. And a funny example that came to my mind, when I was in college, I was dying to go with my friends to a bar. So I found this Persian guy that kind of looked like me, and I got him to give me his ID, and it worked. Every time I would go, they'd look at it, they'd look at me, and they're like, "You're cool." So cross-reactivity is almost like there's enough of a resemblance to the point where the immune system is like, well, you kind of look like this guy, this thing, and I'm going to attack you because you kind of look like what I have as my reference point to attack. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, close enough, right? Like, it's close
enough
enough to the immune system. And, in a setting where you're trying to defend yourself against an enemy, and from a chemical perspective, your survival is at stake, it makes sense for the immune system to err on the side of caution. And if it sees something that maybe is the enemy, go after it as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
My pleasure. So, as this idea of potential cross-reactivity kind of came about, we went about the ways to start crafting a project that would actually map out whether this was indeed true, initially with the intention of trying to understand how the infection itself, how the SARS-CoV-2 infection itself may induce autoimmunity and injury. And I think it has extra relevance now because we're now talking about, new generations of vaccines as the next public health weapon to kind of help us with this infection.
And so as you were formulating this discussion, so the question was, well, can cross-reactivity play a part in this? And how much of a part? And then I think there was a third part of the article, which is how does the cross-reactivity then lead to autoimmunity, and how worried do we need to be? So as you asked these questions, then how did the project unfold? Maybe you can help us understand. I mean, this is one of the most incredible immunological studies or like research studies that I've ever seen. It's really, truly incredible. So once you guys had that theory, how did you go about actually getting the data to then answer these questions?
Well, let's at first acknowledge and respect that there was really a very large global immunology focus on trying to solve this answer. So, getting to this conclusion at this point, was also done with the help of other labs across the world. It kind of began with some very basic mapping studies, right? So we first needed the protein sequences and of SARS-CoV-2, so we could look at what the potential amino acid targets were for the antibodies. When that was published for all the proteins that we knew of for SARS-CoV-2, there were other researchers, Lyons, who basically, did a data analysis and said, here's the protein from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, and here are our proteins. Where is there potential for that misinformation, misfiring to happen? And they found that there were numerous to brain tissue, heart tissue, fat tissue, all over the body. It looked like, all of a sudden, wait, on paper, there's a lot of this potential to happen, which is very unusual. That's not typical for a viral infection, right? And I think it speaks to, the danger of this actual infection, that it has so much similarity to our own tissue, right? And then Dr. Schoenfeld, who is a very brilliant and seasoned immunologist in Israel, did kind of the first studies to say, in reality, do those things actually match up? Is there actual misfiring or misinformation happening in the real world? And he found the answer to that to be unequivocally yes. They found that spike protein, this tremendously important protein for the binding of the virus to us and therefore infection of us, cross-reacted with many parts of the lung surface and surfactant. And that was a potential mechanism as to why people get so much inflammation in their lungs, have difficulty breathing, and also can go on to have, lung congestion and difficulty breathing for months after the infection. So that was the first time someone put, I guess, pen to paper and kind of created a real life example of how this could happen.
So cool.
Yeah.
So if I remember right, in the paper, you talk about the fact that there's almost like a 60 to 70% similarity between the spike proteins and the surfactant in our airway. So, I mean, these proteins are, I don't want to say identical, but they're pretty darn close in terms of how they look.
From an immune system perspective, that's incredibly similar, right? When you see 70% homology, it's almost identical to the immune system. Homology meaning, identical sequences between the two. So that was a very, very significant finding. We know that, SARS-CoV-2 likes binding to, the lung tissue, the ACE receptors there, but to find that it created spike protein, and the spike protein could itself continue the attack against surfactant and the lung tissue itself, was a big deal because let's say you clear the infection, you're going to have spike antibodies in your system, presumably for many months afterwards, if you have a healthy immune response. Because of that misfiring, misinformation, cross reactivity, you could also then have continued lung damage that has nothing to do with the virus itself at any point. At that point, it really just has to do with the leftover immune response.
And that's the scariest part of this, right? The virus itself is awful, and I mean it does horrible things. But part of the next level of complexity is really this lingering immune response that then comes and starts doing all kinds of other awful things.
Absolutely, and I think unfortunately we're still very much in our infancy in understanding what the long-term ramifications will be from the initial infection, and you know, that was really the major focal point of our paper. We need to continue to arm those of us in the medical profession and scientific community with the information necessary to understand what is happening in our patients and the people around the world post-COVID. Also bearing in mind that for the majority of, let's say, autoimmune diseases, they are typically only going to be clinically detectable maybe 3 to 15 years after the initial triggering event, right? Depending on the autoimmune disease you see. So though we're still in this kind of fresh, you know, infection phase of COVID, there will be a larger and unfortunately more profound health crisis in the next decade or so to come related to the I think at this point still unknown autoimmune conditions and immunological dysregulation that happens to people who were infected. And we need the information to be able to figure that out when it happens.
Wow. And I think that this is actually a perfect segue into what you guys actually studied. So Dr. Schoenfeld, all of these other brilliant researchers kind of laid the groundwork for you guys to then come in, and I think you do a way better job than I in terms of, so what did you guys actually study? What was the kind of the essence of your research?
So we really wanted to create a global map for COVID and our tissue, the tissue that, you know, may be susceptible to this misinformation cross reactivity. So we took several proteins from COVID that are involved in the immune response following the infection, spike protein, nucleocapsid protein, the envelope protein, and these are also proteins that are involved in polyclonal antibody treatments, and spike protein is also involved in the vaccine, and kind of put that overlap with our own tissue specifically, right? So not just a computer looking at the sequences, but saying in the real world, if this antibody is produced, what will it actually stick to in our own body? And the results were, you know, I'll say profound. I think obviously I'm biased in saying that, but they really were very illuminating from a clinician's perspective, because they match so well with what we see in this post-COVID long hauler, heart disease, chronic fatigue, you know, brain fog world. You know, I hope that it's a very big step forward for us ultimately in helping those individuals. So I'll just kind of summarize the big things that we found. We found that actually the biggest area of cross reactivity was across the board with the proteins for COVID to be against the mitochondria, the powerhouse of our cells, our energy creation mechanism, right? And to have damage happen to the mitochondria means that an individual will be unfortunately significantly fatigued for a long period of time, because those energy cells cannot produce the way they're intended to. So,
and it's interesting that you bring this up because I'd shared with people some of the studies that talk about how perhaps the mitochondria and the mitochondrial death or collapse are also related to this horrible coagulopathy, because the platelets apparently are very sensitive to any kind of mitochondrial dysregulation. And then there's this entire cascade of events that causes all of these platelets to clot if there's a mitochondrial insult. So it's really interesting that you bring this up. In your studies, there was a huge overlap. This isn't just a tiny little overlap. Like it was like upwards of 60, 70% overlap in terms of the
Correct.
binding.
Correct. And again, spike protein, nucleocapsid, and the envelope protein all cross-reacted with mitochondria. So again, it's important to remember that when we as human beings are infected with a virus, we don't just produce one antibody, right? Like you're not just going to have spike, you're going to produce several, maybe a dozen. So you'll be producing all of these antibodies. So you're not just kind of hitting the mitochondria once, you're hitting them multiple times. And that coupled with the tremendous amount of oxidative stress that comes from the initial infection is a perfect storm for chronic fatigue, quite frankly.
So our immune systems are literally attacking the very organelles that give us life. Our immune system is turning on the essence of what gives us life.
Unfortunately, yes.
Chronic fatigue.
This infection, triggers such an unbalanced and strong immune reaction that we end up attacking the things that keep us alive.
That's disturbing to think about.
Yes.
What are the other things? Because it wasn't just the mitochondria. There's actually a few other really important organ systems that you also found.
Yeah, to me, the next very important area, we know a lot about cardiomyopathy occurring after COVID, so inflammation of the heart. People are suffering from congestive heart failure afterwards because there's death and dying of the heart cells, and we found significant cross-reactivity between alpha-myosin, which is a protein in the heart, and spike protein. And there were several of them. The next area that I found very fascinating and I think is very relevant is that the barriers of our body, the two most important barriers of our body, the blood-brain barrier and the intestinal barrier, are also incredibly cross-reactive with spike, which means that like this very essential defense mechanism of our immune system that keeps us regulated and balanced is disrupted as the result of this infection. And ultimately, that allows inflammation to enter the brain, that allows the immune system to enter a long-term dysregulated state, and unfortunately makes autoimmunity, at least on paper, much more likely following infection.
Help us, that's a really big deal. And I think that statement may kind of fly past some people. Can you help us kind of understand what you mean by that and how the attack on these barrier proteins, how that would then cause a perpetual chronic state of autoimmunity? Because I want people to really get that. That's I think a huge piece of what you guys found and is really important for people to get.
Yeah, I'll step one half step back and just kind of explain something going into this. The yes or no of developing autoimmunity depends on a process called oral tolerance. So for lack of a better word, that's a ability for us to recognize friend from foe. And we spend the first 3 years of our life, as you know, Dr. K, looking at things in our environment, and our immune system learns during that time, this is not an enemy, I will not attack it, and therefore creates that map going forward. If that map that you created in the first 3 years of your life becomes broken, that is how autoimmunity itself develops, and you start attacking things that were previously tagged as friend and are now inappropriately tagged as foe. Okay. Oral tolerance really depends on the appropriate functioning of really one very big important white blood cell. It's called the T regulatory cell, also known as CD3. The T regulatory cell lives predominantly in the small intestine and is receiving information from its immediate environment. And when they're healthy, your immune system is kind of robust against losing oral tolerance. When the small intestinal environment is pro-inflammatory and unhealthy, T regulatory cell function drops and the ability to lose oral tolerance increases. And that is absolutely something that has been found in COVID. We know for a fact that CD3 levels are lower in people who have COVID. And now we know that likely one of the major mechanisms for that to happen is the disruption of the actual proteins that keep the small intestinal barrier intact. That's zonulin. By breaking those, you are essentially creating an inflammatory environment for T regulatory cells, dropping their function, opening the doorway for autoimmunity.
Got it. Got it. So zonulin is one of the proteins that kind of helps keep the gut integrity, right? It's one of the it's almost like the glue that keeps the intestines together. And when that is shot, you basically get what people know as leaky gut. Is that a way? I mean,
Exactly.
I know it's way oversimplistic, but is in my naive brain of understanding things, is that a way to help people see what that's like?
Not naive at all, as always, Dr. K. That's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about what everybody knows is leaky gut. So COVID, what we're saying is the COVID infection and spike protein specifically in the COVID infection causes leaky gut.
And hence why so many people end up with funky, weird abdominal pain, chronic diarrhea, horrible other GI issues.
And
It's
I've had
because
many
of
of those
this.
patients, and they get scoped, by the way. They'll get a colonoscopy. Colonoscopy always looks normal because we're not talking about the cells in the colon, we're talking about the cells in the small intestine. I put them on, traditional leaky gut healing protocols, and 3 months later, their gut symptoms are gone. And this is the mechanism. This is COVID directly causing physical leaky gut.
And well, I'm having a flashback because I remember early on in the midst of everything, you were the first person to point out, like, hey, pay attention to the gut. The gut is actually playing a part in a lot of the autoimmune issues. So this is really kind of going for full circle, because you were the one that turned me on to the immune globulins and the probiotics, and you're the one that helped me actually share this information with other people. So I'm really grateful that you had the foresight to actually see this before we even had the data to now confirm what you already suspected.
Oh, my pleasure. Let's be real, though. Those were the words of my father being channeled through my mouth.
Well, God bless the both of you, because you've really helped a lot of people.
Our
What are
pleasure.
other things that you found? Because there was also the neurofilament protein. So there's some brain tissue, there's thyroid tissue. What are the other ones that really caught your attention as you were doing this study?
Yeah, so there's very significant cross-reactivity with TPO, thyroid peroxidase. That's the main target in Hashimoto's thyroiditis, as you and I both know, a very common autoimmune thyroid disease, and potentially also one of the reasons that people are slow and lethargic and not doing great after COVID. Neurofilament light chain proteins are a very fascinating kind of new discovery, but they are essentially indicators of neuroinflammation or destruction of the destruction of like the scaffold or the supporting mechanism of the neurons of the brain, and they're very tightly correlated with either direct physical trauma to the brain or chemical neuroinflammatory trauma to the brain. So thyroid, neurological tissue, both highly involved, and we also saw very significant cross-reactivity to GAD65, which is also present in the neurological tissue and is associated with psychosis and other things.
And that's why there's people talking about how post-COVID they're seeing an increase in psychosis. And GAD is basically, if I remember, glutamic acid decarboxylate. So it's basically this enzyme that breaks down glutamate, and glutamate is highly irritating to the brain. So
Correct.
it's what causes some people to go absolutely nuts. Like the autistic kids actually have errors in this enzyme because they have way too much glutamate, which is why they're just constantly on edge. So this basically causes some people to go off the edge because they just have all of these irritating compounds and inflammation and irritation in their brain.
I mean, given the current environment, a COVID infection itself, strictly without any physical change, is an incredibly anxiety-provoking experience, right? You're in quarantine. You're concerned that you're going to be the person that you saw on the news, lost their legs secondary to COVID or died, or whatever it is. I think that's very internally generating of anxiety, and then on top of it, there is a physical disruption to this protein metabolism, and then there's another kick for anxiety in that direction.
Were there other proteins that people should be aware of, or were these really the high yield? So we talked about the heart, we talked about the intestines, we talked about the thyroid, the mitochondria for sure, um, the brain. Any other ones that really came out in your research?
The one that I'm very interested in as far as future implications are concerned is beta amyloid.
Mm,
This is involved in the world of neurodegeneration, another, research passion for my dad and myself is neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And we really know today that amyloid is a misfolded protein that reacts to something in the environment. And to find specific cross-reactivity between the antibodies against COVID and beta amyloid means that, again, this is potentially something that may 10 or 15 years down the road trigger another increased wave of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's on top of the tremendous wave that we're already
mm.
experiencing. So that's very concerning to me. That's a very big red flag for us in the future.
Thank you for sharing that. And that I saw that in the article. I'm like, oh, that's not a pretty thing. Now, as some of our viewers are watching this, I'm sure what's going through their mind is, well, 99.7% of people plus survive. And, there's a lot of people who are totally asymptomatic. And I think that, while we take this into context, I think a lot of people are going to say, well, maybe this isn't relevant to me. And, again, I've been the one that has always said, like, people take this virus seriously, but don't start completely freaking out over it, because if you are eating well and taking care of yourself and your immune system is in good form and you do all of the things to do that, hopefully your immune system will take care of this and you will move on. So I think this is one of the questions that's going through a lot of our people. Like, yes, you found this in the lab, but what does this mean in the real world? Because we know of the catastrophes and we know of the consequences and people falling apart, and it happens often enough. You had COVID, your family had COVID, you take care of COVID patients all the time. Can you put now this data in context with the real world? And for the people that are trying to figure out, like, hey, like, I see a lot of people doing well. And some people are totally asymptomatic, which is awesome. Over 50% of people are asymptomatic, which I think is great, right? So this isn't doom and gloom, but how do you take this data and now put it in real life context and help people kind of understand what all of this means? If you're forget about if you're totally immune compromised. Let's not even talk about the 85-year-old diabetic, hypertensive, the catastrophic risk factor. And well, maybe how do those high risk individuals fit into this picture? And then how about the low risk individuals? Maybe we can talk about it like that. Is that a good way to look at it?
Absolutely. I think it's the same discussion, quite
Okay.
frankly. This is a wake-up call from the universe to put time and preventative attention and energy into the health of your immune system. I mean, those of us in the integrative and functional world have been preaching this for years and years and years and years, because we're seeing this massive increase in autoimmune disease before COVID. We're seeing, environmental toxin illness all over the place, and the immune system is the key and the focal point of this. But there is no bigger call to action or wake up call than this, as far as putting your time and attention into your immune system. We need to have more access and more effort into individual assessments of what's going on with your immune system, individual treatment plans for balancing the immune system. And I think everybody needs to put some everyday attention into this. We need to nourish those Treg cells in our gut. We need to live an anti-inflammatory life. We need to take care of ourselves. The world is increasingly more dangerous to us, and COVID is a huge step in that danger direction. But at the same time, we have more and more and more information available to us as human beings to combat that. We just need to take it to heart and be proactive, not just kind of sit back and say, I survived COVID, or I know people who survived COVID, I'm going to be fine. Put all that energy and effort into making sure that you're one of those people. And if you had COVID, making sure that you're not going to be one of those unfortunate millions of people who end up with autoimmune disease afterwards. This is the time now. not tomorrow, now.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And I think that's really an important thing. And this is one of the things I've stressed, that this isn't just doom and gloom. You can change the course of things. You can empower yourself to change your odds. And all of this entire discussion is to inform you of, what can happen if your system is unhealthy versus if your system is healthy, your Treg cells are in good shape, your gut is in good shape, your mitochondria are in good shape, your general immune system, your microflora are in good form. All of that can help tip your kind of state from one pro-immune state into potentially not going there, right? Is that
Correct. Absolutely. I'll use my own infection as the example, right? So I had COVID, very unexpected circumstance for me. I was being extremely careful and actually routinely testing myself back in July and got hit, in a very blindsided way. It was a rough, 14 days, as I think it is for the majority of people. But, quite frankly, on day 15, I snapped out of it. I was 100% back to normal and I had no lingering symptoms. I was extremely proactive, obviously, during my infection, and am very proactive about my immune health going into whatever I'm doing. And, I think what happened was my immune system, it's a very inflammatory virus. I felt it. And the second the virus was cleared, my immune system said, you know what, okay, everything's hunky dory here. We're fine. Let's go back to the way we were before. And, it's not something that we want to take lightly. At the same time, it's not something that we want to say, this is the end of us, right? We're capable of going back at this thing. It's just, we have to have the knowledge and the desire to do so.
Got it. And I think as an extension to what you said, it's also, while we shared all this information, I'm sure in the minds of some people, they're like, oh my God, if I get COVID, I'm for sure going to end up with mitochondrial disease, and I'm going to die, and my brain is going to, and everyone's going to get Alzheimer's and so forth. So this isn't to say that everyone that gets COVID gets these immune reactions, right? And I think that may be something to highlight, that these are possibilities, and depending on how healthy or not your immune system is, you could possibly get these things. And that's what makes this virus serious. And we've always known this virus is not a joke. But I think for some of our viewers who have the propensity to kind of run with things a little bit further than they should, maybe we can just clarify that we are saying that if your immune system is healthy and if your immune system is balanced, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fall apart. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right. This is just about what is possible in a test tube, in a vacuum with COVID, right? Not what is happening to everybody out there in the world. I think, again, take care of yourself, and you're going to be fine.
Great. And so let's kind of go with that. If we're looking at the average healthy adult, what is their possibility of, and obviously with the general population, so you've got the uber healthy people like yourself, and you're very proactive in terms of what you eat, what supplements you're taking. So you're like the top 1% of health. I mean, I know the way you and your family eat and the way you guys take care of yourselves. You're very vigilant, which is fantastic. I love it. Let's say you're the average bear. You're eating a little bit more gluten than you should. You're eating a little bit more dairy than you should. You're taking you're drinking alcohol a few times per week because you just need to relax. You're not great about taking supplements. You kind of take them here and there. For the average person who's generally healthy, and we know that, again, 50% of even the average population is either asymptomatic or 70, 80 plus percent, I forget the statistics, do really well with this virus. Can you contextualize this for the average person? Like, what does this mean in terms of how often these things may pop up, or we just don't know?
Yeah, we don't know. I think this was, alarming because there is possibility for the future. We do know that about a third of all, let's say, healthy middle-aged people who are infected are going to have several symptoms that linger for 3 months at least following their infection, and we're trying to understand why that's happening. And again, with any big, new virus that enters the human domain, there's going to be a risk of a whole rash of autoimmune disease that develops afterwards in some people. Certainly, it's going to be a very small percentage of those that were infected, but on the global scale, that's a lot of people. So, how if you're kind of average on everything, I think chances are really good you're going to be okay. But there is going to be also a good chance that someone is not going to be okay from this. And I think it's our job in the medical and scientific community to be able to arm ourselves with things to be able to help that person, right? So this is meant to be for that. And there's this whole other question that's come up now, right? We now have vaccines being very rapidly implemented.
Yeah.
Everyone's asking how safe are they? What are the implications for the long run? And that's another very big area of unknown as far as long-term health is concerned. I think the biggest question I get in my population, which is, I see a lot of patients with autoimmune diseases, is this safe for me? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the frank answer is I don't know. I also don't know how safe a COVID infection is for you. Right.
Well, do you mind if we kind of talk about the vaccine itself? So basically, they take a fragment of the DNA. It's actually the RNA of the virus. They inject it into the body, and then that makes a small part of the spike protein. So it's not the full spike protein. It's just a segment of the spike protein, which then triggers our immune system to wake up and say, hey, if I see you, I'm going to come after you. Based on the little we know, and we don't know much, how can you help us contextualize what kind of a mess can that make? And obviously we don't know exactly, or do we know what part of the protein, the spike protein, is made from the vaccines, or we haven't gotten to that degree of education?
No, we do.
Or...
Yeah, we do. We have the whole sequence of the spike protein that's generated from mRNA. It is a 90 kilodalton size chunk of the receptor binding domain of spike protein. So spike protein it looks kind of like a pyramid with about 30% of it sunk underneath the ground. So the part that's generated by the mRNA is the part that sticks out of the ground. And that's the part that unfortunately has most of the cross-reactivity with human tissue. So the mRNA is actually encoding that entire sequence. It's very inflammatory, right? It's very immunogenic. So it creates this pretty significant potent immune response, which is, why people's arm hurts like hell and they don't feel so good, particularly after the second shot. But, looking at it on paper, right? With a COVID infection, you're going to generate antibodies to numerous proteins, and there are numerous potentials for cross-reactivity. With the mRNA vaccine, there is only one protein and a different set of cross-reactivities that, at least on paper, are less than the infection. With the infection, you get very significant dysregulation of the immune system. You drop your CD4 and CD8 counts, that's T helper and T suppressor. You drop your T regulatory cells, as I mentioned. And that's, the infection kind of primes the immune system to roll into that autoimmune world. It's very early, but at least on paper, that doesn't happen with an mRNA vaccine. So, I think this is a uncharted territory as far as a vaccine conversation is concerned. We don't have a lot of experience with mRNA vaccines. At the same time, we're dealing with a virus that seems pretty clear that given X amount of time, unless you're going to live, in a bunker somewhere, you're going to be exposed and infected. So you kind of have to look at the unknowns and the knowns here, and the unknowns and the unknowns on the other side, and make a personal decision about what to do here. And there are people who I think the vaccine will be a better choice for. And there are people that maybe it'll turn out that it's not the right choice for. At the same time, put respect to the fact that we're in the middle of a global public health crisis, and maybe there isn't the time to kind of sit down and look at all those nuances in the short term and make those decisions.
Yeah. And, I think that's if I can highlight what you're saying in my own words is, folks, we're not here to tell you what to do. And certainly, I don't think they're, based on what both of us are saying and what I'm hearing Dr. Vojdani say is, neither of these are great pictures, right? There are problems with the vaccine. We totally don't understand this sucker. 5 or 10 years from now, we may look back and be like, damn, we didn't see that coming, right? There may be things about this vaccine that we won't understand because it's a totally new technology. It's not like we've had experience with this for decades and decades to truly understand what it does, how it does it. Does it mess something up? Does the mRNA go somewhere else? And does it get into a cell and ultimately cause some kind of other weird reaction we don't know? There's all kinds of those conversations that are valid, and we just don't know. And I think really the whole purpose of this discussion and why I feel so blessed to have had Dr. Vojdani here is for you to get an understanding of what can this virus do. And at least we have now some understanding based on the incredible work that Dr. Vojdani and his father and others have done, and all of the other researchers out there who are just working night and day to figure this sucker out. And then there's the vaccine. And we know a little bit about it, not a whole lot. And I think that from my perspective, what I would say is just sit with this information and push out the noise, push out the other people's opinions. I'm not here to tell you what I think you should do. And as you saw with Dr. Vojdani, he has not told you one way or another. He hasn't said get the vaccine or don't get the vaccine. I know him as a practitioner, and he has no strong allegiance to vaccines, and he's certainly not anti-vaccine, and neither am I. I think you should get clear in your heart of what you think is best for yourself and your family. And given this data, given what we know, whenever the time is right, and you may need 2 or 3 months to get clear, not that you can even get the vaccine as that person in the public, but be clear in your heart. What feels right to me? Does it feel right to me to get the vaccine? Maybe it doesn't feel right. Maybe I still don't trust things enough to get the vaccine, and I'm going to sit with it. And that's perfect. But everyone needs to come to a conclusion for themselves. Everyone needs to feel in their heart and in their mind, based on the information we have, and there's a lot of unknowns, what is the right decision for you and your family? And what would you say? I mean, is that a good way of having people think about it? Is there any wisdom that you want to share with them?
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. I really would just mirror exactly what you said. You need to look at, kind of everything, all the options, look at, what your life looks like right now, look at what's going on with your family, and make the decision that's right for you. That it's impossible to say what's right or wrong in this scenario. It's just unprecedented. So I think everyone's intuition will lead them in the right direction for themselves. And let's respect what other people decide for themselves as well.
Amen. Amen. Yeah. And guys, again, don't live in a state of fear. I mean, I've talked about this before, and I actually, in one of the articles before I wrote it, I got a discussion with Dr. V. Like, chronic stress, chronic fear doesn't help you. If anything, chronic stress and fear actually disrupts the zonulin. It actually disrupts your gut integrity. It actually predisposes you to ending up in this pathway of autoimmunity. Would you agree with that, Dr. V?
Yes, your Treg cells do not like anxiety and fear and stress.
So push that aside. Live as healthfully as you can. Take care of this incredible body, and honor yourself by feeding yourself healthy foods and taking care of the thing that's most important, your body and your family's bodies. Anything else, Dr. V? I mean, I'm so, first of all, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. You're such a busy guy. You've got a family, you've got busy practice. You're doing I don't know how you do all of this, research and practice and take care of a family. Like, God bless you for all of this. And really thank you for taking the time to just be here and share all of this wisdom with us and our audience.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me. I do this because, I love the ability to help everybody out there. I truly wake up every morning and say, thank you for giving me this opportunity. My message to everyone is, we'll get through this. We're going to be okay. Every day we learn more about ourselves and about the world. And as long as we're open to that information, we will be okay.
Yes, I love that. And guys, it's a tough situation we're in. This virus is not pretty. This data is alarming, but we're all, like he said, we're going to be okay. do your part to take care of yourself. And we're going to ride this out. And hopefully we can look back and be like, God, that was just a weird, weird time in society in so many ways. But hey, the sun is out, things are shining again, and life is going to go on. Well, thank you, Dr. Vojdani, for taking the time, sharing all of this wisdom, and just giving this beautiful message and all of this wonderful information to our audience. And guys, thank you all for watching and taking the time to take this in. And please just share this message with other people that you think this could help. Just give them a little bit of clarity in terms of, should they get the vaccine? Should they not? What should they do? Thanks for watching. This is Dr. K.